$1? You're out of your mind. Trailer trash. Dennis Davies sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco into the Oregon dust. Brandy Roberts didn't flinch. She held out the crumpled $1 bill, her scarred fingers steady. Behind the steel pipe fencing, the massive blue roan stallion thrashed, slamming his hooves against the rails with bone-shattering force. He's killed 2 of your men, Denise. He'll kill a 3rd before sundown, Brandy said, her voice cutting through the heavy July heat. Take the $1, or watch your empire bleed out in the dirt. The Triple D Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of prime Umatilla County real estate, a monument to arrogance built in the shadow of Oregon's Blue Mountains. The July sun beat down on the parched earth, baking the smell of manure, sagebrush, and sweat into the still air. Denise Davies stood by the reinforced steel corral, the brim of his pristine silver belly Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He was a man who owned everything he saw, and broke everything he owned. At the center of the corral was a nightmare wrapped in a blue roan hide. The stallion, standing a massive 17 hands high, was a cyclone of muscle and rage. His coat was slick with nervous sweat, his eyes rolling back to show the stark white of pure, unadulterated panic. They called him Widowmaker, though his registered name had long been forgotten. He had already shattered the collarbone of one ranch hand and caved in the ribs of another. Brandy Roberts stood on the opposite side of the fence, the toe of her scuffed Red Wing boots hooked on the bottom rail. She was 26, but possessed the weary eyes of a woman twice that age. Her faded Levi's were patched at the knees, and a simple leather belt held up a frame that looked too fragile to survive a stiff wind, let alone a killer horse. But Brandy knew horses. She knew the language of prey animals, the translation of fear into violence. You're a fool, Brandy. Dennis laughed, the sound dry and humorless. Beside him, Sabin Resende, the ranch foreman, chuckled. Sabin was a brute of a man with a jagged scar running down his jaw, known around Pendleton for using a heavy hand and a cruel whip on anything that didn't immediately submit. He's headed for the slaughterhouse tomorrow, Sabin sneered, twirling a braided leather quirt in his thick fingers. Boss is taking a loss just to put a bullet in his head. Ain't no one riding that freak. I'll ride him, Brandy repeated, her voice dead calm. She kept her gaze fixed on the stallion. The horse stopped thrashing for a fraction of a second, his ears swiveling toward the soft tenor of her voice. And I'll buy him, right now, for $1. Dennis turned to her, his lips curled in a mocking grin. He looked at the crumpled bill in her hand, then back to the roan, who had just kicked a dent into a 2-inch steel pipe. A wicked, calculating light danced in Dennis's eyes. He hated Brandy. He hated her because she owed him nothing, because she worked at Claudia Pritchard's diner in town, instead of begging for scraps at his ranch like the rest of the locals. You want to die for $1? Dennis said, his voice dripping with malice. Fine. Sabin, draw up a bill of sale on a napkin, but when that beast stomps your skull into the dirt, I ain't paying for the ambulance. I won't need one, Brandy said. She handed the $1 to Sabin, who snatched it with a grunt of disgust. But if I ride him out of that gate before sundown, he's mine. Free and clear. You got a deal, trash, Dennis spat. Let's see you bleed. Brandy didn't immediately walk into the corral. Instead, she retreated to the shadow of the tack room, seeking a moment of absolute stillness before stepping into the cyclone. The air inside the low wooden shed was thick and stifling, smelling heavily of neatsfoot oil, old canvas, and the sharp tang of dried horse sweat. She leaned the back of her head against the cool, weathered cedar siding, letting her eyes slip shut. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm she forced herself to steady with long, deliberate breaths. In the dark behind her eyelids, she remembered the smell of her father's old leather duster. She remembered the Nevada high desert, the alkaline dust coating her skin, and the gentle, almost musical way her father used to whisper to the wild mustangs they gentled. A horse's violence is never born of malice, Brandy. His rough, smoke-cured voice echoed in her memory. It's born of terror. They're prey. When a prey animal feels trapped, it fights with everything it has just to survive the next 10 seconds. Don't fight the muscle. Talk to the terror. You're going to get yourself killed, Brandy. She opened her eyes to see Adrian Dickinson standing in the doorway, blocking the harsh square of sunlight. Adrian was one of Dennis's ranch hands, but unlike the others, his soul hadn't been poisoned by the Triple D's culture of cruelty. He was young, soft-spoken, and held a custom Brazos saddle over one shoulder. His face was pale beneath his sunburn, etched with genuine, sickening concern. Adrian, she nodded, pushing off the wall and reaching out to run her hand over the supple, worn leather of the saddle's fender. Did you bring what I asked for? He sighed heavily, shifting the heavy saddle to lean against a barrel of sweet feed. He reached into his canvas vest pocket and pulled out a simple, hand-tied rope halter. It was soft, made of thick marine braid, entirely devoid of metal hardware, no bit, no spurs, just like you asked. But Brandy, I'm telling you, this isn't a scared Mustang. Sabin's been working that horse over with a heavy logging chain in the dark for 3 days. He tied him short to a post and beat him until he couldn't stand, trying to break his will. That roan doesn't just hate men anymore. He hates the whole damn world. He's going to tear you apart the second you step off the fence. He's hurting, Adrian, Brandy murmured, taking the soft rope into her hands. She ran her thumbs over the knots, feeling the familiar, grounding texture. Sabin tried to break him by breaking his spirit. You can't break a spirit that large without creating a monster. If you give a horse nothing but pain, pain is the only currency he has left to spend. You have to give him a reason to trust the ground he walks on. Adrian shook his head, looking down at his boots. Claudia was crying at the diner this morning when she heard what you were planning. She said to tell you your mother wouldn't have wanted this. She said your dad dying the way he did was enough blood for one family. Brandy's jaw tightened at the mention of her parents. Claudia Pritchard had practically raised her after her mother died of a sudden fever, and her father, unable to cope with the silence in their home, drank himself into an early, tragic grave. Claudia's diner was a sanctuary smelling of black coffee, sizzling bacon, and huckleberry pie, a world entirely separated from the blood, dust, and broken bones of the rodeo and ranching circuit. But Claudia didn't understand the invisible, magnetic pull of a broken thing. Brandy looked down at her own hands. They were a roadmap of rough miles. She traced a pale burn mark from a dally rope gone wrong, and the jagged white line across her knuckles from a barbed wire fence. These scars were the physical manifestation of a hard life, but they were also lessons. She knew what it meant to be cornered, written off, and abused. Tell Claudia I'll be back for the dinner shift, Brandy said, looking up at Adrian with a faint, determined smile touching the corners of her lips. And tell her I'll need an extra stall in her barn tonight with fresh straw. She turned and walked back out into the blinding, merciless sunlight of the arena. The crowd of ranch hands lining the fences had grown, drawn like vultures to a carcass. The air literally crackled with morbid anticipation. They had come to see a slaughter, to watch the arrogant girl get put in the dirt. Brandy took a deep breath of the hot, dusty air, smelling the metallic, unmistakable tang of blood and adrenaline radiating from the pen. It was time to speak the only language the stallion understood. The heavy steel gate groaned on its rusted hinges, a high, piercing squeal that made the hairs on the back of Brandy's neck stand up. As she unlatched it, a collective hush fell over the spectators. Conversations died. The clinking of spurs ceased. Dennis Davies leaned against the top rail, casually smoking a thin, dark cigar, his eyes glittering with cold, cruel amusement beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him, Sabin stood near the narrow roping chute, his thick, calloused hand resting eagerly on the braided handle of the 12-foot bullwhip coiled at his hip. Brandy stepped into the deep, churned dirt. She pushed the gate, and it clanged shut behind her with a dreadful finality, sealing her inside the 80 by 80-foot arena. There was no way out now. The roan froze instantly. He was at the far end of the corral, backed into a corner like a prize fighter on the ropes. His massive chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths, and his gunmetal coat was lathered in a thick, soapy white foam. Blood trickled down his chin from his mouth, where Sabin's heavy, twisted wire iron bits had mercilessly torn his gums and tongue. The horse snorted, dropping his massive head low to the ground, pinning his ears so flat against his skull they seemed to disappear. He pawed the dirt with a dinner plate-sized hoof, kicking up a thick cloud of ochre dust that drifted across the sun-baked pen. It was a clear, unmistakable warning broadcast in the purest language of nature. Take one more step and I will end you. Brandy didn't step forward. She stood perfectly still, letting her boots sink slightly into the soft dirt. She didn't look him in the eye. Staring is the action of a predator locking onto its prey. Instead, she angled her body away from him, lowering her shoulders, letting her spine curve slightly to project absolute passivity. She held the soft rope halter limply at her side, her hands entirely devoid of tension. Minutes ticked by, agonizing and slow. The July heat was suffocating, pressing down on the arena like a heavy wool blanket. Sweat stung Brandy's eyes, but she didn't wipe it away. From the fence line, a ranch hand coughed nervously. The silence was stretching too long for the men who thrived on action and violence. Sabin grew visibly impatient, his face flushing red. "Go on, girl," Sabin barked, his voice shattering the fragile quiet. "Show us that horse-whispering magic. Stop stalling." Without warning, Sabin uncoiled his bullwhip and cracked it viciously against the top metal pipe of the fence. The sharp, explosive crack echoed across the valley like a gunshot. The roan exploded. Driven mad by the sudden noise and the terrifying memory of pain it brought, he reared up on his hind legs. He towered against the blue summer sky, an eclipse of muscle and fury, his front hooves striking the empty air. With a shrill, bone-chilling scream that sounded almost human in its agony, he dropped down and charged straight at Brandy. The ground physically shook beneath his weight. Clods of dirt flew out behind him. 2,000 pounds of terrified, weaponized muscle bore down on her, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. "Brandy, move!" Adrian screamed from the rails, his voice cracking with sheer panic. She didn't run. She didn't brace for impact. She didn't throw her hands up to protect her face. As the shadow of the beast fell over her, she merely let out a long, slow breath and sank straight to her knees in the dirt, bowing her head toward the soil. The stallion, completely unprepared for his target to simply collapse without a fight, panicked. He threw his weight backward, skidding violently, digging his back hooves deep into the soil. He slid for 10 feet, throwing a tidal wave of hot dirt and gravel over Brandy's bowed form. He stopped less than 3 feet from her. She could feel his massive chest heaving just inches from her face, blowing hot, wet, sweet-smelling breath into her tangled hair. He had expected a fight. He had expected her to raise a whip, to shout, to strike out in self-defense, giving him the excuse to trample her. When she offered total, undeniable submission, offering her unprotected neck to him, his violent instinct short-circuited. His brain, wired for combat, suddenly had no equation to process what was happening. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Brandy raised her head. The dust settled around them. She didn't reach for him. She just began to hum a low, rhythmic, guttural vibration deep in her chest. It was an old Navajo lullaby her father used to sing on stormy nights, a sound that mimicked a mother mare's reassuring rumble. The stallion snorted, tossing his heavy head side to side, deeply confused by the lack of pain and shouting. He took a hesitant, trembling step sideways, watching her with a large, dark, deeply bloodshot eye. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, carrying only to him over the sound of his own frantic heartbeat. "I know what they did. I know they hurt you. I know the dark, but the dark is gone now." She stayed on her knees in the dirt for 20 agonizing minutes. She let the sun beat relentlessly down on her shoulders, ignoring the cramping in her legs. just humming and breathing until the horse's ragged breathing finally began to match her slow, steady rhythm. Finally, the massive blue roan took a tiny, tentative step forward. He lowered his massive, battered head, his whiskers twitching, and sniffed her shoulder. Brandy slowly raised her hand, palm up, fingers open. She let him press his velvet muzzle into her scarred palm, feeling the hot, wet breath on her skin. The devil Umatilla County feared was just a profoundly frightened ghost, after all. The silence around the perimeter of the corral was deafening, thicker and heavier than the dust hanging in the air. Dennis's cigar had gone out entirely. It hung forgotten from his parted lips, a long cylinder of gray ash dropping onto his expensive shirt. Sabin's hand had dropped completely away from his whip, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and superstitious dread. No one moved, no one spoke. With excruciating patience, Brandy shifted her weight and stood up. The roan flinched, his head jerking up a few inches, muscles twitching under his sweaty coat. But Brandy kept her movements impossibly fluid, like water flowing gently over river stones. She moved in slow motion, raising the braided rope halter. She didn't force it. She held it open and let him lower his nose into it. She slipped the soft crown piece up behind his ears and tied the knot. He tossed his head once, a residual, deeply ingrained instinct to fight any restraint, but the soft marine rope didn't bite into his raw wounds like Sabin's iron bits had. There was no sharp pain. He settled, closing his eyes for a brief second, and let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to empty weeks of terror and tension from his massive frame. "Adrian," Brandy called out softly, her voice carrying across the silent arena. She didn't turn her head, keeping her gaze softly focused on the horse's shoulder. "Bring the blanket and the brazos." Adrian scrambled over the heavy steel fence, nearly tripping in his haste, his eyes wide as saucers. He approached with slow, exaggerated steps, practically trembling as he handed her the thick wool saddle blanket and the heavy leather saddle. Brandy took the blanket first. She held it out, letting the horse smell the sheepskin, letting him realize it wasn't a tarp or a chain. Only when he exhaled against it did she gently drape it over his back. He twitched violently, his skin rolling to shake off the unfamiliar weight. But he miraculously held his ground. Next came the saddle. It weighed over 40 pounds, but Brandy hoisted it smoothly, setting it down on his back with the care of setting glass on a table. She reached under his belly, her hand brushing his sensitive flank, and grabbed the cinch. She secured it with slow, deliberate tugs. Most cowboys cinched a horse tight all at once, cutting off their air and causing them to panic. Brandy tightened it an inch, waited for him to exhale, and then tightened it another inch. She gathered the single, simple rope rein. She hadn't asked Adrian for a bridle, and she deliberately unhooked the heavy wooden stirrups from the saddle, dropping them into the dirt. She wasn't going to dig her heels into him. There would be no kicking, no spurs. She grabbed the saddle horn with her left hand, grabbed a handful of his thick, tangled black mane with her right, and pressed her weight hard against his left shoulder. It was a warning, a physical question. "Are you ready for my weight?" He stood still, taking a deep breath. She swung her right leg over his back and settled softly into the deep leather seat. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the horse went completely rigid beneath her. The trauma of 100 past riders, the biting spurs, the screaming, the beatings, the choking chains flooded back into his brain. He dropped his head low between his front knees. He arched his back into a steep, rigid curve, turning himself into a loaded spring, preparing to buck her so hard she would land in the next county. Brandy instantly dropped the single rope rein. She didn't pull back. She leaned entirely forward, laying her torso flat against his sweaty neck. She buried her face in his coarse mane, wrapping her arms around his thick neck in a deep embrace. "No pain," she whispered directly into his swiveling ear, pressing her steady heartbeat against his erratic one. "We ride together today, or we die together today. I don't care which, but I promise you, there is no pain here." The stallion trembled violently, vibrating like a plucked guitar string. He danced sideways, his heavy hooves clattering against the hard-pan dirt hidden beneath the loose soil. But the explosion never came. The warmth of her body holding him, the absolute lack of cold iron in his bleeding mouth, the miraculous absence of sharp steel rowels tearing into his flanks, it was a profound revelation. It broke the cycle. Slowly, the steep arch in his back melted away. He raised his head, let out a deep breath, and began licking his lips, chewing an imaginary bit, the universal equine sign of submission, processing, and deep relaxation. Brandy sat up straight, taking the single rope rein lightly in 2 fingers. She shifted her weight slightly to the right and clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth. The worst, most dangerous stallion in Umatilla County walked forward. His gait was smooth, immensely powerful, and completely, willingly under control. Brandy guided him in a slow, wide circle around the perimeter of the arena. The horse, responding instantly to the slightest shift of her hips and the gentle lay of the rope against his neck. She turned him toward the gate. "Open it, Adrian," she said, her voice ringing clear and triumphant. Adrian, grinning so hard his face looked like it might split, ran forward and swung the heavy steel gate wide open. Brandy rode the blue roan out of the corral, his giant hooves crunching loudly on the gravel driveway. She stopped directly in front of Dennis Davies, looking down at the ranch owner from the back of the 17-hand giant. "$1, Brandy said quietly, her eyes locking onto Denise's furious, humiliated stare. "Keep the change, Denise." She nudged the stallion with her calves, and together they trotted down the long, dusty driveway of the Triple D Ranch, leaving the arrogant, silent empire far in their wake. 2 weeks later, the town of Pendleton was buzzing with preparations for the annual summer exhibition, a precursor to the famous Pendleton Roundup. Brandy had named the roan Brimstone, and the 2 of them had become local legends. She rode him through the streets, his coat shining like polished gunmetal, his demeanor as calm as a gentle breeze. Claudia Pritchard had given them the pasture behind the diner, and every day, crowds gathered just to watch the girl who bought a demon for $1. But Dennis Davies was a man who could not stomach humiliation. Inside the mahogany-paneled office of the Triple D, Dennis poured 2 glasses of expensive bourbon. He slid one across the desk to Veronica Gradnigo. Veronica was a ruthless cattle baroness from Texas, a woman whose investments could either double Dennis's empire or bankrupt it. "I'm hearing rumors, Dennis," Veronica said, her sharp green eyes sizing him up. She didn't touch the drink. "I'm hearing a waitress from a greasy spoon bought your prize killer stallion for $1 and broke him in an hour. Makes me wonder what kind of operation you're running here. If you can't manage your livestock, how can you manage my capital?" Dennis's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. His knuckles turned white around his glass. It was a fluke. The horse was drugged. The girl pulled a con that's making you the laughingstock of Umatilla County, Veronica replied coldly. "I'm coming to the exhibition tomorrow. If I see that girl parading that horse around, showing up your $1 million quarter horses, I'm pulling my investment. I don't partner with losers." When Veronica left, Dennis hurled his glass against the stone fireplace, shattering it into 100 pieces. He hit the intercom button on his desk. "Sabin, get in here." When the heavy-set foreman entered, Dennis's eyes were cold and dead. "That exhibition tomorrow. Brandy is entering Brimstone in the freestyle reining. I want that horse crippled, and if the girl gets caught in the crossfire, so be it." Sabin smiled, the jagged scar on his face twisting. "I'll take care of it, boss. Ain't no wild horse gonna make a fool out of us twice." What neither of them knew was that Adrian Dickinson had been standing in the hallway, carrying a stack of feed logs. He heard every word. Adrian dropped the logs and sprinted for his truck, tearing out of the driveway toward Claudia's diner. He had to warn Brandy. The Pendleton exhibition grounds were packed. The grandstands were a sea of Stetsons, plaid shirts, and denim. The smell of roasted peanuts and horse sweat hung thick in the air. In the staging area near the Umatilla River embankment, Brandy was brushing Brimstone's flank, the horse nuzzling her shoulder affectionately. "Brandy," Adrian came sliding down the grassy bank, out of breath. You have to pull out. Sabin is here. Dennis ordered him to cripple the horse. They're going to ambush you before you hit the arena. Brandy's brush stopped. She looked at Adrian, then at the massive roan. Fear threatened to grip her. But Brimstone nudged her chest, blowing a soft, reassuring breath. I'm not running, Adrian. If I run, Dennis owns me for the rest of my life. Go find Sheriff Gonzalez. Tell him what you heard. Adrian hesitated, then nodded, and took off toward the main grandstand. Brandy tightened Brimstone's cinch and swung into the saddle. She rode away from the crowded holding pens, taking a quiet trail behind the cattle chutes that led to the arena entrance. The shadows were long here. The noise of the crowd muffled. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales. It was Sabin. In his hand, he held a heavy, iron-tipped logging chain. End of the line, little girl, Sabin growled. Time to put this freak out of his misery. Sabin didn't aim for Brandy. He swung the heavy chain low, aiming directly for Brimstone's front knees, intending to shatter the horse's legs. But Brimstone was no longer the panicked, cornered animal in Denise's corral. He was a warrior who had found his partner. As the chain swung, Brandy didn't pull back. She leaned forward and gave Brimstone his head. The stallion didn't flinch. Instead of retreating, Brimstone lunged forward with explosive speed. He sidestepped the chain with unnatural agility. Sabin's momentum threw him off balance. Before the foreman could recover, Brimstone reared. It wasn't a buck of fear. It was a strike of vengeance. 2,000 pounds of muscle and iron-hard hooves came crashing down. Sabin screamed as a front hoof clipped his shoulder, sending him spinning into the dirt. Brimstone landed, pivoted on his hind legs, and kicked out with devastating accuracy. The double-barrel kick caught Sabin squarely in the chest and right leg. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the alley. Sabin crumpled into a heap, screaming in agony. His leg bent at a grotesque angle. From the end of the alley, Denny Davies appeared, his face pale with fury. In his hands, he held a Winchester Model 1894 rifle, leveled directly at Brimstone's chest. You miserable piece of trash, Dennis roared, cocking the lever. I'll kill you both. Drop the rifle, Dennis. The booming voice echoed off the metal chutes. Sheriff We Told Gonzalez stepped out from the shadows behind Dennis, his hand resting firmly on the butt of his service revolver. Beside him stood Veronica Gradnigo, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The broken foreman, the armed rancher, and the calm, majestic stallion standing protectively over the girl. Sheriff, this beast attacked my man, Denny stammered, his arrogance faltering. I saw the whole thing, Davies, Sheriff Gonzalez said, drawing his weapon. Sabin attacked the horse. And you just pointed a rifle at a young woman. Drop it. Now. Dennis looked at the sheriff, then at Veronica. You're done, Dennis, Veronica said, her voice like ice. The deal is off. I'm pulling every dime. You're a pathetic, desperate man. Dennis's hands shook. The Winchester slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly into the dirt. Karma had finally come to collect its debt. The sun was beginning to set over the Blue Mountains, casting a fiery golden hue across the Pendleton Arena. The crowd roared as Brandy Roberts rode into the center of the dirt ring. She wore her faded Levi's, her scuffed Red Wings, and a smile that lit up the stadium. Beneath her, Brimstone performed flawlessly. They didn't need a heavy bit, or spurs, or a whip. They moved as one entity, spinning, sliding, and loping with a grace that brought tears to the eyes of the grizzled ranchers in the stands. Over by the holding pens, Dennis Davies sat in the back of Sheriff Gonzalez's cruiser, his hands cuffed behind his back. The charges of attempted assault, animal cruelty, and reckless endangerment would ensure he lost the Triple D ranch. The banks, spurred by Veronica Gradnigo's withdrawal, were already moving to foreclose. Dennis watched through the wire mesh of the police car as the girl he called Trailer Trash won the grand prize buckle. Claudia Pritchard and Adrian Dickinson cheered from the front row, Claudia wiping her eyes with a checkered napkin. After the exhibition, Brandy rode Brimstone away from the flashing cameras and the cheering crowds. They rode out toward the Umatilla River, the cool water rushing softly over the stones. Brandy slid off the saddle, loosening the cinch to let the horse breathe. Brimstone lowered his head, nudging her chest gently, demanding his reward. Brandy laughed, pulling a crisp red apple from her pocket and letting him crunch it from her scarred palm. She thought about the $1 she had handed to Dennis just weeks ago. It was the best investment she had ever made. She hadn't just bought a horse, she had bought her own freedom, proving that true strength wasn't found in breaking a spirit, but in healing it. The wind picked up, rustling through the sagebrush. Brandy swung back into the saddle, turning the massive blue roan toward the open plains. They had a long ride ahead of them, and for the first time in her life, the horizon didn't look like a threat. It looked like home. The dust eventually settles on every battlefield, but the legends born within them ride on forever. Brandy Roberts didn't just tame a killer. She saw a shattered spirit and offered him the one thing the Triple D Ranch denied him: grace. In the unforgiving West, they proved that a single dollar of mercy holds more power than $1 million of cruelty. Dennis Davies learned the hard way that empires built on broken bones will always collapse under the weight of their own karma. Brimstone was never a demon, he was simply a mirror, reflecting the darkness of his captors and the enduring light of his savior. If you felt the dust, the danger, and the undeniable bond in this Western tale of redemption, don't let the journey end here. Like this video, share it with your fellow Western fans, and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below. Would you have stepped into that corral for $1? Ring the bell, and we'll see you on the next ride.